Alright, so it's definitely been a minute since I put a video up. I mean, realistically, it's been about a week, maybe two. So yeah, that's not nearly as long as it's usually been in the recent past, but it's because I've been waiting on parts. So parts are finally in. So one of the things we've been waiting to get in before we can move forward with the motor was a set of piston rings. So went over to Diamond last week and we got ourselves a brand new set of total seal piston rings. And to save myself from hours and hours of headaches with hand filing rings, we have got an electric ring filer. So today we're going to go ahead, get these rings filed up, fitted in. Then once everything's fitted up, we can't go right to assembly. Unfortunately, there's one more very important critical step before we can actually final assemble the engine. And that final critical step that we need to make sure we address is right here with the crankshaft. Now, we already did get the crankshaft cleaned up, and that was mainly just for measuring rod bearing clearances. But there is another thing we need to get done to this crankshaft before everything can go together for final assembly. Now we have the rods, the bearings, the crank, the pistons, and the rings. The rings were the only thing left that we were actually waiting on before we could do this final step, and that's getting the actual rotating assembly balanced. So whenever changing a crank, changing rods, changing pistons, you want to make sure everything is perfectly balanced, otherwise it's going to shake itself apart, and that's a bad time, especially on a motor that's going to be living most of its life at the higher RPM range. And in order to balance everything out, we need to have the rings, the bearings, the pistons, the rods, everything. Everything that goes into the rotating assembly has to be there to get weighed. That way, the proper weights can be put on the crankshaft when it goes together for balancing. So, rings do have weight, and when it's moving at a significant RPM, that weight is pretty essential. So, we have to make sure we get our rings gapped before we send everything out to get balanced. But then once that's done, this motor is going to be ready to go back together. So for now, we're going to go ahead and get started with getting these rings fitted up. Let's get into it. Alright, now that we have the rings properly gapped, unfortunately we can't just put this thing back together, slap it together and throw it back in the car. We do have to take the crank out, send the rotating assembly out to get balanced properly. It's pretty important that everything's balanced, that way it doesn't just, rattle itself apart. I like to think that's probably why my last engine lasted as long as it did, was because everything was measured properly, balanced correctly, and, a good recipe to make an engine last a long time. So as soon as it gets back from the machine shop, properly balanced, it's ready for final assembly. So I definitely might have left out a couple things that I need to take care of before we final assemble this engine, and it's mainly prep work. It actually has nothing to do with the engine block or the rotating assembly or the heads or cleanup or measuring or anything like that. It's got to do with some welding. So I have a brand new Canton Racing oil pan that is going onto the motor right here, and before this can go on, I need to drill and put a bung in this for the return line for the turbocharger. So I need to go ahead, drill that out, and weld on a bung to this pan. And then I also have the oil filter adapter block that goes onto the bottom of the pan right here. And I need to weld fittings onto this as well. So it's got 12 AN ORB threaded holes in it already, so if I had 12 band ORB to -10, because that's what my lines are, I could just thread those on here. But I have noticed over the years that from taking those fittings on and off, because I have taken them apart a couple times on my old setup, that the O-rings wear out, they can start to leak. So what I do is I actually just weld the fittings onto the block, and then I don't have to worry about them leaking at all. So I need to go ahead and weld those fittings on. So we're going to get into that right now. Now we're done. So we've got everything prepped, ready to go, so as soon as the rotating assembly is back from the machine shop, we're ready to final assemble this engine. Now I'm sure you might be wondering like why I threw in a bunch of like B-roll of the 3D printer going, and I don't know. I just had my camera going while the 3D printer was rolling and I thought it looked cool, so I thought I'd throw it in the video. If you're curious as to what I was printing, it was this right here. Basically just lets me set the rings in at the same height consistently and quickly. I know a piston with a ring on it works just as well, but this actually works a little bit better, and, you know, 3D printer, so that's what this is for. I also already dropped everything off the machine shop a couple days ago, so hopefully I'll have it all back this week, and we can get started on reassembling the engine next weekend, and hopefully all goes well. I got gaskets and all that stuff ready to go, so as soon as it's back in the machine shop, final assembly time. Put it back in, start building turbo kit. Anyways, guys, that's going to be it for this one. So like the video if you liked it, subscribe to the channel if you're new, follow the build along. Until the next one, I'll catch you guys later.